I'm really glad I bought all that Greta Gerwig stock in 2017. It's really paying dividends. Barbie is Gerwig's third movie as a solo director. Her first was a smaller scope, smaller budget personal story about where she grew up. Her second was a fresh take on a beloved novel that kind of breathed new life into otherwise well-trod territory, with a bigger cast, a bigger budget, and more ambition in its storytelling. Now her third is a much bigger budget, much bigger scope, much more valuable piece of IP designed for a much broader audience. Some might call this the Ryan Coogler trajectory. A through line I see in her movies, and probably what I like most about her movies, is that they all feel very personal. She's on the record that Lady Bird isn't exactly autobiographical, but even so, it's a high school movie set in the exact time and place of Gerwig's own high school experience, so she's clearly mining from her own life. To use her words, none of it happened, but it's all true. She's also on the record that Little Women was a book she read over and over and over as a kid from such a young age that she doesn't remember a time when she wasn't aware of the March Sisters. And that's reflected in the movie, which is a faithful adaptation to a point, but also kind of deconstructs the narrative and has the characters voicing things that Gerwig wishes they had voiced, and gives the characters the ending that Gerwig wishes they'd had in the book. Plus, she kind of amped up how textured that story is about authorship, so you implicitly feel Gerwig's presence more as the author of that movie. And even when she has a $140 million budget and it's clearly aiming for a much broader audience, it doesn't really feel any less personal. I don't know what Mattel was expecting from the live-action Barbie movie they've been trying to get off the ground for the last 15 years, but I doubt their first choice would have been a third-wave feminist reckoning with a relic of second-wave feminism. But that's the perspective that Gerwig brought. That's her personal take on Barbie as a concept. It's funny, when I talked about Little Women a few years ago, I danced around the idea that Gerwig is putting stories she probably told herself as a kid on screen. The phrase I actually used is that she's playing with her toys as a filmmaker. Little did I know. Wouldn't you know it, Gerwig's next project is a couple of Narnia movies from Netflix, so she will presumably continue metaphorically playing with her childhood toys on screen for the foreseeable future. I'm in. With Barbie, the infusion of things that Greta Gerwig liked growing up isn't limited to the characters this time around. It's in the filmmaking style. She said in interviews how much she and her kids love the physical comedy of Charlie Chaplin, and how she's amazed that kids not yet old enough to read the title cards in silent movies still howl with laughter watching Harold Lloyd dangle from a clock. How physical comedy really is a universal language. So the broad, dancer-like physical movements of the silent era comedies informed how they put together the chase sequence in the Mattel offices, for example. Similarly, the Dance the Night Away number and I'm Just Ken are both filmed in the style of the soundstage musicals of the 50s and 60s. Then there's the 2001 homage in the opening. When I first saw this, I was just tickled that she's doing a shot-for-shot remake of the greatest movie opening of all time, but then I had the thought, will people get this? Then I had the thought, doesn't really matter if they get the context because the cinematic language still plays like it did in 1968. The point gets across whether you know the context or not. That said, if I may be Kingsley Ben-Adir with The Godfather for a moment, the obelisk in 2001: A Space Odyssey is largely understood to be an accelerant of evolution. Once upon a time, there were these man-ape primitive beings, and the appearance of the obelisk spurred them to ultimately evolve into human beings with the discovery of tools. What the Barbie opening astutely identifies is that once upon a time, girls only ever played with baby dolls and therefore maybe only ever imagined themselves as mothers. Equating Barbie with the 2001 obelisk argues that she in fact spurred the evolution of what little girls could imagine for their own adulthood. Their discovery of tools was the notion that they could grow up to be whatever they want. To quote Helen Mirren's opening narration,
she has her own money, her own house, her own car, her own career. Because Barbie can be anything, women can be anything. And this has been reflected back onto the little girls of today in the real world.
And it's this whole conceit that I think is the most ingenious part of the movie. The idea that Barbie opened up little girls' imaginations for what it must be like to be a grown-up woman. And Barbie Land as depicted is explicitly tied to real-life grown-up women's childhood imaginations. It's the grown-up world they imagined as kids, where, thanks to Barbie, all the problems of feminism and equal rights have been solved. And so the movie is really about girls growing up and discovering the disconnect between how the world is and how they hoped it would be. From everything is pink and wonderful and fun to the world is complicated and terrible and patriarchy exists. I know it's been noted by some that this is kind of feminism 101. To which I say, what were you expecting from this? I'm sorry that this $140 million toy commercial didn't delve deep enough into bell hooks for your taste, but what are you really looking for here? On the other end of the spectrum, some people thought this was bombing innocent families with feminist propaganda, and even found it to be misandrist, which I kind of think you just have to laugh at, especially given everything with Ryan Gosling's Ken. He's introduced with the line,
Barbie has a great day every day, but Ken only has a great day if Barbie looks at him.
It's a wonderfully succinct but clear way to sum up the whole conflict of the movie. Barbie likes Ken, she's indifferent to him, so he lashes out and almost ruins the world over it. But he has a great arc, from adorable loser to villainous to sympathetic to self-actualization, defining himself as his own person rather than as an accessory. I think Gosling's pretty great in this, both in the broad comedy aspects and in the scorned lover low points, and I'm glad the Academy recognized his performance. A little puzzled that Margot Robbie wasn't also recognized for her performance because it strikes me as a bit of a tougher role to play. Barbie discovers an interior life around the end of the first act, and Ken doesn't discover an interior life until the climax, so her character has to walk a more precarious path for a longer stretch of the movie, while Ken can coast on more big, broad exteriority. Margot Robbie's great as the poised, perfect Barbie in the first 20 minutes, but I don't think anybody was particularly surprised Margot Robbie could pull off something like that. But she's also great once things start to go wrong with her. Like Gosling, she's got to play a lot of this really big, and I feel like it's easy to overlook here how often going big like this goes wrong. But she's really threading a needle here. There are good fish out of water beats once Barbie and Ken go to Venice and Century City. And by the way, I first saw this movie at the Century City AMC, and those jokes played particularly well with that crowd. But I think my favorite parts of the movie are in Barbie World. The opening is so great. That Lizzo song and 2 consecutive morning routines, one establishing the perfection of the world and the other conveying something going wrong with Margot Robbie Barbie. All of that worked really well for me. It's funny, it's clever, it's creative, it's a vibe, and you immediately see in this sequence why this is the odds-on Oscar favorite for both production design and costumes. That said, my absolute favorite scene in the movie is when she's just sitting on the park bench and letting herself feel things for a minute or two. Again, it's the moment she kind of discovers an interior life. And it was the first moment in the movie that made me feel the way I felt watching the driving through Sacramento scene in Lady Bird or the bookbinding scene in Little Women. And while Robbie is not nominated as an actress, she is nominated as a producer for Best Picture. And it was her role as a producer that brought on Greta Gerwig to the project, which is probably the best decision Margot Robbie's made in a long time. Elsewhere in the Oscars, there was some hubbub when this was deemed an adapted screenplay by the Academy, despite it being an original story not really adapted from any one thing besides the existence of Barbie as a product. On the one hand, kind of a tough beat because this may have actually won original screenplay, and the competition's a lot tougher in the adapted category this year, but on the other hand, no one walked into this movie not knowing who Barbie and Ken are, so I kind of get the adapted categorization, I guess. Also a tough beat that Greta Gerwig didn't get into Best Director, though she was nominated at the Directorial Guild Awards, and that's nothing to sneeze at. That said, given the field, I personally probably wouldn't have nominated her myself. I see the movie as a feat of screenwriting more than a feat of directing, but that's kind of getting super nitpicky. Had she gotten in, I would have thought it was great, and that she didn't, I'm not too bent out of shape about it because she'll be back. For the most part, I kind of just think the movie's a miracle. I had high expectations given the Greta Gerwig of it all, but even so, this is, at the end of the day, a $140 million toy commercial. Try and forget how much hype it had and how much money it made and how well it's been received by critics and audiences and awards bodies and how much it took over the culture. Just taking a step back from all that and just thinking about what this is on paper and how good it ended up being, it's pretty miraculous.